Well, welcome to the NMI podcast, and we have a very special guest today. We're speaking with Patrick Holford, and for those of you who are not familiar with Patrick's work, you should be. And before we get into the conversation, I'm going to give you a bit of background into Patrick and all the accolades and work that he has done over the years. So he's the founder and chair of the Food for the Brain Foundation's Scientific Advisory Board. He's a retired visiting professor. He specializes in nutrition for mental health. He's authored over 45 books and is also in the Orthomolecular Medicine Hall of Fame. Importantly, also, he's been instrumental in pioneering clinical nutrition in the United Kingdom and much further afield. And related to that, in 1984, he was founder of the Institute of Optimum Nutrition. So a bit more detail. He started in the field of psychology and became a student of two leading pioneers in this field, real heavyweights in the field, Dr. Karl Pfeiffer and Dr. Abraham Hoffer. In 84, he then went on to found the Institute of Optimum Nutrition, which is now a degree accredited profession, and really was instrumental in the first generation of nutritional therapists and what it means to, practice personalized nutrition. Related to this, his mentor and twice Nobel Prize winner was Linus Pauling, who was also a patron of the Institute of Optimum Nutrition. He then left the Institute in '98 and went on to become an advocate. At this point, he started committing to his literary career, published the Optimum Nutrition Bible, which was published over 2 million copies and really catalyzed arguably a global revolution. I remember seeing this when I was a student in Australia many years ago. It's really phenomenal impact globally. Since then, over 45 books in 30 languages, and his focus at the moment is, and has been for a long time, on helping people with mental health issues. And related to this, in 2003, founded the Brain Biocenter, and then in 2007, the Food for the Brain Foundation. In 2014, was inducted into the Orthomolecular Medicine Hall of Fame, joining Linus Pauling, Abraham Hoffer, and a great many other heavyweights in the field, and is also honorary recipient of a diploma from ION and honorary fellow of the British Association of Nutritional Therapists. He's also a retired visiting professor. So big introduction, Patrick. It's a huge privilege for us to be speaking with you today. Thank you for being on the show.
And thank you. It was really good and interesting. I'm so glad you mentioned Dr. Karl Pfeiffer, because he often gets left out. And he was the man who put zinc on the map. And the way that happened, by the way, was he had a patient, Lisa, a girl who was schizophrenic, and her parents had learned out how to keep her sane, and that was to give her an oyster every day. And they found it was zinc. So, he put zinc on the map, and we hear about pyroluria, cryptopyrroles, etc. He put that on the map. I was studying psychology, came across a randomized placebo-controlled trial on B3 niacin, first ever in the history of psychiatry, jumped on a plane, went to meet Abraham Hoffer, said, how many people have you treated with this megavitamin approach? I was a psychologist, not a nutritionist. And he said 3,000. And I said, what's your success rate? He said 85% cure. I said, well, you better be specific, because I've never seen a cured schizophrenic. What do you mean by cure? And he said, free of symptoms, able to socialize with family and friends, and paying income tax. And I had never seen a schizophrenic paying income tax. So I hung around and met quite a few formerly schizophrenic people who were no more crazy than me, and then became his student. And it was Abraham Hoffer who introduced Linus Pauling to the concept, and between them generated the word orthomolecular, the right molecules, which then Jeff Bland, studying with Linus Pauling, turned into functional medicine. I turned it into optimum nutrition. You've turned it into nutritional medicine. It's all the same stuff. And I think we don't quite realize that the origin was before that, and that was Darwin, who said there are two fundamental drivers of evolution. One is the conditions of existence, and the other is natural selection. And the conditions of existence are more important, because natural selection doesn't kick in until the conditions of existence change. For example, I've just been in London. I saw a fox playing in the garden. I live in Wales on a 20-acre farm. You never see a badger in London. When urbanization occurs, good for foxes, bad for badgers. But in essence, the aristocrats and the monarchy, and then later Hitler and the whites versus the blacks, they all loved the idea of natural selection. And then when genes were discovered, they went batshit about genes. And I know we're going to talk about Alzheimer's, and considerably less than 1% of Alzheimer's is caused by genes. So there is still this obsession about genes when we should be talking about the conditions of existence, which nutritional medicine is a big part of. So it's fantastic to have people like you, the next generation, so I can ease up a little bit. I'm approaching 70, and I've just got my paraglider license, and I need to practice more.
That's such a brilliant introduction. Thank you so much. One of the questions I had for you was how did you land in this? And I think your history and involvement with all these pioneering individuals is really unique. And thanks for the whistle stop tour. I know there's a lot more to it than these individuals and these chance meetings. It's many decades in the making, but it's wonderful that you can give listeners some of that color of where this all comes from. And brilliant. So your area of focus at the moment is Alzheimer's, and we're going to dig into that. And what I want to start with is this controversial idea for many, not necessarily us, but this controversial idea that Alzheimer's is not only preventable but treatable. And can you expand on that? I think that'd be a really good place to start, just to buck this idea that it's an inevitable part of aging and there's not much we can do about it.
Yeah, and there is this extraordinary inability to ask the fundamental questions about what causes something. I'll give you a very simple lateral example to that. One of the new risk factors for Alzheimer's in the Lancet Commission, which is a terrible report in many respects, is hearing loss. So go right, hearing loss is a risk factor for Alzheimer's. But the question you have to ask is, why do some people lose their hearing and others don't? And then if you research it, you find it's inflammation. And you find that higher omega-3, less hearing loss, as a very, very simple example. And then you find out about B vitamins and methylation and hearing loss and so on. So, it's a bit like high blood pressure is a risk factor, but drugs that lower high blood pressure don't work. So you have to ask what's causing the high blood pressure. So you keep having to ask, what's under this, what's under this, what's under this. And as I said earlier, there are three known causative genes: APP, a mutation of the amyloid protein precursor gene, presenilin 1 and 2. And I think there are 500 families with APP. It's a very, very, very small number. And what most people don't realize is that these people make more amyloid. So they do have more amyloid plaque, which is largely in the synapses and kind of, holds things together when there's a problem in the brain. It has a function. So, for example, if you infect the brain, with anything really, you will produce more amyloid. So the idea that you could have an anti-amyloid injection, antibodies that attack amyloid, makes a lot of sense for those people. And there have been 2 trials on those people with anti-amyloid drugs, and one showed no effect on cognitive function and the other showed a worsening. And they both showed considerable adverse effects, which are brain swelling and bleeding. Because if you rip out all the plasters on your injuries, you're going to get bleeding. And so if it doesn't work for those, with the gene, how the hell is it going to work for those who have not got the gene? So now to answer your question, if we go to UK Biobank data, and this is a study in Nature Journal last year by a group of our scientists as well at the Alzheimer's Prevention Expert Group. By the way, I'm not really a sort of scientist like a professor, but my skill or burden is that I have to study all these people's ideas and then put them into English. And what it concluded was, from the UK Biobank data, 73% of dementia can be prevented. It was looking at their questionnaire. It didn't take into account any blood measures. So it didn't include homocysteine or HbA1c or any actual, questions. So without homocysteine, omega-3 index, HbA1c or anything else, the conclusion was 73% can be prevented. But when you understand that, if 1% is cause, or less than 1%, and by the way, those people with the causative gene still get remarkable benefits when you lower the homocysteine, increase the omega-3 and all that sort of stuff. You realize that possibly 99% of people can prevent Alzheimer's to a considerable extent. And Alzheimer's is 63% of dementia, and vascular dementia is about another 13%, and mixed dementia is another 10%. And mixed dementia is usually vascular and Alzheimer's, and vascular and Alzheimer's are caused by the same things, prevented and treated by the same things. So you end up with close to 90%, 89% of all dementias could theoretically be prevented in 99% of people. And I wrote this book because I was pissed off. I've kind of decided to stop writing books. But the point is, there's such a scam going on, and it's not really being told in full. And by the way, what was amazing, I've got about 16 professors, who checked absolutely every piece of this. Especially on the the amyloid business, because what people don't realize is, apart from the fact that lecanemab, aducanumab, donanemab, none of them have even approached half of what would be a clinically significant improvement. In other words, they haven't worked. And the last one, donanemab, shrunk or increased the rate of brain shrinkage by 20%, while B vitamins and omega-3 have reduced DHA, that is, have reduced the rate of brain shrinkage by 73%. So we're looking at 73% good or 20% bad. Same studies, placebo-controlled, using the same measures, the clinical dementia rating, the same measures of brain shrinkage, and well over 3 times the clinical benefit. And here's the big difference, and people don't realize this. It's about 1 in 200 people on these trials have died. And these are not normal deaths. The first death was reported by the physician as it was literally like her brain exploded. I've never seen anything like it. The second one, the lady in question had a sort of stroke, and they gave the normal medication to stabilize someone who's had a bleed. And the husband said it was like her brain was on fire. It took 8 of us to hold her down. She had to be sedated. And then a little while later, we turned the life support off. So, can you imagine a study on vitamin C where 1 in 200 died, a horrific death, and the headline of the newspaper in the Telegraph or Times or Guardian or anywhere is big breakthrough in Alzheimer's. And that's what really, pisses me off, because ethically, we've got to stop this. But behind that is a fundamental concept, which of course we all understand in relation to cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and everything, which is really the concept of total load. And I was reading Dale Bredesen's recent book on, brain aging, and I just liked the words he used, because actually I went to university to study economics and then switched to psychology due to an amazing life experience. And supply and demand, that's what we learned. And so most of these diseases are simply a function of a lack of supply of the conditions of existence, the nutrients, omega-3 and B vitamins and antioxidants and etc., and too much demand, toxins of one sort or another, whether it's smoking, drinking, etc. And so it's a total load thing. So in a sense, the first chapter of my book is, amyloid does not equal Alzheimer's. The second is about genes. And the third is it's a systems-based approach. And I think that is really where we have to switch. And, in a very sort of brief nutshell, because we can go deeper, you can take every single known risk factor for Alzheimer's and you can neatly put it into one of 3 categories: something that affects the structure of the brain, like a stroke, for example, and we know that omega-3 is part of the structure of the brain; the function of the brain, in other words, the sugar supply or ketones or antioxidants or oxidants or pollution, etc., or the utilization of the brain. Hence, hearing, seeing. If you're deaf and you're blind, you don't get the stimulation. If you're depressed, if you don't exercise, all that sort of stuff. And as soon as you realize this, you've actually got a systems-based model. And that's what Alzheimer's is. I actually picked Alzheimer's because my big debate was, how do we really get people interested in prevention? I'd already learned that no one pays any attention until they've got diabetes and they've got heart disease, and then they pay attention. So I figured that the fear, this was in 2013, would be Alzheimer's. It's now the biggest fear. It's the biggest healthcare cost. It's the biggest killer. So it's sort of not bad to say that once you've got holes in your brain, you can't reverse it. I know we're quite aggressive and we're looking at how late in the process and how aggressively could we actually reverse or treat something, which is all valid. But, broadly, there is a point where you can't do anything about it. And that creates this tremendous fear. And so I picked Alzheimer's as the arrow to actually get a message of prevention across, because the truth is everything you do to prevent Alzheimer's prevents diabetes, heart disease, cancer, arthritis, and all those other diseases of our metabolism.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's beautifully put. I mean, there's so much to unpack there. I think one of the things I'd like to try and summarize for listeners is what's wrong with drugs, like a drug-based approach. And the reason I'd like to briefly dig into that is because I think it draws really important contrast to the approach that you're talking about. They're very different ways of looking at the disease. So do you want to speak a little bit to that, the
Yeah.
one
I
target
mean,
approach?
exactly. So, I mean, I remember, getting the notes from a GSK new chairman meeting, several years ago. And, the money is in blockbuster drugs. So the money is in a drug that you can prescribe to millions. And there are 11 million people right now where if there was a drug that worked, it's a big market. So 250 billion, I estimate, has been spent trying to develop an Alzheimer's drug. And I'd say we've got nowhere. That's a lot of money, and a lot of return. And the big problem, as I said, is I believe, and we watch this, like, Parkinson's, dementia, it's all very, very much connected. Methylation, omegas, I'd love to talk about that interaction because it's so important. But we see, you know, Jeremy Paxman, really bright guy, got a very active mind, you know, drifts into Parkinson's. So the point is that I believe you can get Alzheimer's just from being omega-3 deficient, or just from having a high homocysteine, or just from having no utilization, like being really depressed and lonely and all the rest of it, or just drinking too much alcohol. So the point is the drug model requires one mechanism. And the real shocker, so unpack this, because I was just looking right now at who is driving this sort of agenda for the amyloid drug, and it's Sir Rory Collins. And he was Sir Professor Rory Collins, who was the guy who set the whole thing up for statins, where the Oxford statin collaborators owned the data from the trials. No one else was allowed to see that data. They didn't disclose the data to outside researchers, or only that they wished to. And they had a very sneaky little trick, which is before the trial began, they'd get people on the statins, and those who reacted badly to the statins were excluded from the trial. So when they actually started the trial with their placebo versus statins, they had people who didn't react to statins, and thus they minimized the adverse effects. And, over $1 trillion was made on the idea that you have a blood test called cholesterol, and then you need a drug called statins. I'm 67, my triglycerides is 0.8, my HbA1c is 4.9%, my homocysteine is 7, I'm fit, I'm active, I have no risk for cardiovascular disease, my blood pressure has not changed, in the 50 years that I've known it. And I go to the doctor and they say, oh, your cholesterol is 5.6. And I'm using the calculator given to me by National Institute of Clinical Excellence. And it says you need to be on statins for the rest of your life. And I say to the doctor, what's the NNT for statins for me? The numbers needed to treat. And he said, how on earth do you expect me to know that for all the drugs I've prescribed? And I said, well, that's your job, isn't it? Because it's infinity. So what's going on right now is exactly the same thing. And here is a real irony I probably shouldn't even say, but basically there's multi-millions put forward to find a blood marker, a blood test to predict if you're going to get Alzheimer's. And, that's going on. And you kind of think, everyone over 50 will have an amyloid test, or maybe a p-tau 217 test. And I go, you've got this disease, you're fine, like high cholesterol. And now you need this drug, even though the drug doesn't exist. So to validate the blood tests, there's now a pitch to find a cognitive function test, a digital cognitive function test, to show that the blood test works. And if I say to you, would you like a blood test to find out how fit you are? You go, shouldn't I have a fitness test? So here's a shocker. The cognitive function test, which we digitized, which is what they do in memory clinics. So we took the paper and pencil test of memory clinics and validated exactly this. with permission from the professors who developed the different tests for executive function, episodic memory, attention, and so on, which we've now run 450,000 of. That score, designed to find out if you're entering, cognitive impairment, is decreasing pretty linearly from the age of 18. So, 2 weeks ago, I mean, today is Alzheimer's Prevention Day worldwide, by the way. So do check out the website alzheimersprevention.info. It's got a quick 3-minute test that people can do to see where they're at, alzheimersprevention.info. But now we're testing 5 to 18-year-olds. So now you start thinking, hang on a second, cognitive function, attention, episodic memory, executive function, it's the same brain in kids as it is in adults, And then one of the major breakthroughs that's been made in this field is the omega-3s generally do not work for Alzheimer's unless you have a low homocysteine, which means you've got good B vitamin status. And the B vitamin lowering, homocysteine lowering B vitamins, even in those with high homocysteine, don't work in those who are low in omega-3. And then you realize that neuronal membrane is made by attaching a phospholipid to either DHA, principally omega-3, or arachidonic acid, omega-6. And the attachment is done by methylation. And methylation depends on B vitamins. So it makes total sense. It's like you can't build a house without, a hammer, a nail, and wood. And so if we now look, 2 days ago, we got the data from Northern Ireland schools. 1 in 14 children in school in Northern Ireland have a diagnosis of autism. Many more would be autistic. And in Scotland, it's 1 in 16 children have a diagnosis of autism. We know that both autism and Alzheimer's risk is massively increased by high homocysteine in either the mother in pregnancy, which is the important time, or in the child or in the adult for Alzheimer's. And we also know, like from the ULSPAC study of nearly 12,000 pregnant women, the lower the intake of seafood, the higher is the risk of numerous symptoms, which will be classified as autism. And there are some studies, which I can't reveal yet, which will come out very, very soon. In the world of kids, they haven't really cottoned on to, as most people haven't for adults, the omega-3 B vitamin combination. And that sort of interaction is really difficult to get into in confounding variables, meta-analyses, and all the rest of it. And when you look at the National Institute of Health, who looked at the population attributable risk, they assigned 22% to raised homocysteine and 22% to a lack of seafood or omega-3. And in China, the best study to date of 396 studies, 165 randomized controlled trials, had homocysteine-lowering B vitamins as the single most promising treatment. And then we have the UK's Lancet Commission, which for the third time running, 2017, 2020, 2024, did not even mention homocysteine, even though we'd sent all the trials. And then very sneakily, in a section called Not Enough Evidence, cites one study on omega-3, which was highly beneficial. They said it reduced brain shrinkage, it reduced cognitive decline, it protected against dementia. But the idea was there's only one study, so we can't do a meta-analysis. And I just put in omega-3 and dementia into PubMed just now and got 860 studies. Last 5 years, 250 studies. Staring you right in the face is not only a study, but the study authors, very good study, it showed 64% less risk for Alzheimer's in those with raised DHA. But it then did a meta-analysis of over 100,000 people, which then showed a very, very, very clear risk reduction. So in other words, the idea of the Lancet Commission is we couldn't do a meta-analysis because there's only one study, but somehow we are the world's leading experts on dementia, and we don't know how to use PubMed, and we don't know how to put in omega-3 plus dementia, and we don't know how to look at a great big, really robust meta-analysis staring us in the face, which should tell us, we don't have to work very hard. We could just use those results. but
Yeah.
instead they ignored it.
Yeah.
So, this is deception. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Deception by omission.
Yeah, it does. It certainly feels like that. The evidence is there and it's being missed. And I think related to all of this, I'm wondering if you can, I know your, colleague and friend, Professor David Smith from Oxford has been involved in a lot of the original pioneering work in this area of B vitamins, homocysteine lowering, and that
Yeah.
interaction with omega-3 fatty acids. Can you just talk, because this was all randomized controlled trial data, can you talk the listeners through his
Yeah.
work and what he's found?
Yeah. So Professor David Smith was Vice Dean of Oxford Medical School. He had 300 researchers underneath him. They effectively defined that Alzheimer's was a shrinkage of the medial temporal lobe, the hippocampus. And so, in other words, a cognitive function test, a poor result, can diagnose you with dementia. But in order to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's, which is two-thirds of dementia, you need a brain scan of the central area of the brain. And that is now globally accepted and used. So that's his background. Then they found raised homocysteine in the brain of people with Alzheimer's, then designed an RCT, B6 20 milligrams, folic acid 800 micrograms, and B12 500 micrograms, and got 53% less shrinkage in the brain in those in the top quartile. So a very important point, which is relevant for so many areas, is that homocysteine above 11, or technically 11.3, absolutely predicts brain shrinkage. So it doesn't if it's below 10, but above 11, it does. So in people above 11, their brains stop shrinking by 53%. When they looked at the Alzheimer's related areas of the brain, they got 9 times less shrinkage. These are brain scans, you can't argue with them, 9 times less shrinkage. And when they did the clinical dementia rating, which is a clinical assessment, 30% ended the 1-year trial with no clinical dementia rating at all. In other words, could no longer be diagnosed with MCI or pre-dementia. And then that was in 2010. In 2017, they published, they went back to the blood samples, split the group into thirds. The third with the lowest omega-3 had no benefit from the B vitamins. And the third with the highest omega-3, we don't know that's optimal. It was just the third in the group with the highest omega-3 in their blood. They had 73% less shrinkage, which brought the shrinkage down below that, which you find in normal older people who do not measure cognitive decline. So, the brain shrinkage has stopped, the cognitive decline has stopped, and, there you go. And what I didn't realize until recently, because what was quite funny was my experts wrote to the Lancet Commission. One group wrote on omega-3, didn't publish the letter. Another group wrote on effectively sugar, didn't publish the letter. Another group wrote on homocysteine. And what emerged many months later was they said, we can't publish your letter on homocysteine because it has appeared on the Food for the Brain, website. Right? So, but they replied in the Lancet to the homocysteine letter just recently. So in other words, the case for the defense is disclosed, but the prosecution is not allowed to speak. It's a very weird kind of peer review. And that got me interested because basically they cited, this is very clever, they cited a study by a guy called Paul Asen and Van Dijk, in which they took people with Alzheimer's and measured their homocysteine and gave them the right dose of B vitamins, which lowered the homocysteine but made no difference to their cognitive function. Quid pro quo, doesn't work. Now, here was the interesting thing. Number one, the homocysteine level to start with was 9. So it's not in the brain shrinking zone. And it did drop to 7. Now, this is a bit like giving painkillers to somebody without pain and then reporting there is no pain.
Yeah.
But what is sort of interesting is I then go to, actually, there are 12 sort of amyloid drug companies listed that these guys are consultants of. And then recently, the lecanemab study comes out in the New England Journal of Medicine. Who are the authors? Van Dijk, Asen, the same players. So, in other words, the employees of the whole anti-amyloid drug push are employed to design a study that looks like it's doing all the right things, and somehow, because it's very, very, very hard to find people with Alzheimer's with the homocysteine of 9, clever, clever. And that was how it's done. It's a stitch up.
Yeah, it's incredible. Well, a question then I have for you is, that I mean, all this is just like quite revelationary, but keeping back in the theme of homocysteine and omega-3 fatty acids, I know you've spent quite a bit of time looking at nutrient gene interactions and how these interplay. Can you speak a bit to the role of genetics as a risk factor for Alzheimer's and then how it interacts with nutrition?
Yeah, so there are genes that predict risk. So we'll leave aside the very, very rare causative genes. And probably the two we most know about is ApoE4 or ApoE, which is apoprotein. So in other words, it's the gene to make apoprotein, which is the trailer upon which you put your cholesterol, so to speak, or lipoprotein. Apoprotein with a fat becomes lipoprotein. So that's the territory we're in, fat delivery. And by the way, people with ApoE4, need a lot more omega-3. There's a few other things too. So that's one we know about. And then a very, very critical, not the only, but very critical methylation gene, which helps to turn that homocysteine into SAMe, acetylmethionine, which does all the methylation, is MTHFR, methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase. And if you happen to have the mutation MTHFR 677T, or you have a double mutation TT, like ApoE4, you can be single or double. Both of those increase risk for Alzheimer's. There's no question. That's true. So then what I did, starting with MTHFR, is we have studies like David Smith's at Oxford and many others, where, of course, in any decent study, they've measured the presence of this to make sure that the placebo group and the treatment group have a similar number because it's a confounding variable. So they've measured this, which in both cases in about 20% of people, gave the B vitamins, gave the placebo, and then at the end, is there a difference in outcome, better or worse? In those groups, no difference. It's just the same. So in other words, the negative effect, which does exist, the risk if you have MTHFR 677TT is higher that you will develop Alzheimer's, but once you're taking the B vitamins that lower the homocysteine, it's not there anymore. And similarly with the finger or going on to ApoE4, we see exactly the same thing. Big study in the British Medical Journal, Gia is the author. 7 times less risk for Alzheimer's dementia if you have a healthy diet versus an average diet, and I think 11 times less risk on healthy diet versus a poor diet. Again, measured ApoE4. Is there any difference in the outcome? None. Then you have the finger trial, which is a multi-intervention, and there you've got exercise, you've got interaction, you've got diet, you've got a whole lot of things going on. Again, they measure these gene polymorphisms. Is there any difference in the outcome in the two groups? None. And I'm very, very sad because the finger trial used to measure homocysteine and has now stopped. It's been taken over and is now funded by the Drug Discovery Unit or the Drug Discovery Foundation. And you can imagine who funds that, which then funds the World Dementia Council. And ironically, the World Dementia Council goes around the world inviting politicians and policymakers together, and a couple of professors had recommended to them that I attend their last session on prevention, and they wouldn't let me go. And I actually went on the day just to sort of see how it would go, because the claim was there's no room and it's invitation only. And there were 50 badges on the table of people who didn't turn up. I said, oh, yeah, I know them. Very busy clinicians. So there were 50 empty chairs. They said, no, you can't come in. So as the chair of the leading prevention charity, I was prevented from attending the World Dementia Council. And it's probably because last time I went with Jerome Byrne, the award-winning medical journalist, and everyone was talking about amyloid. At one point, he stood up, and at another point, I stood up and mentioned, something not amyloid, and probably off the list now. So the point is these, and I'm not saying it's not worth testing genetic polymorphisms because, a bit like I mentioned with ApoE4, if you have it, omega-3 is important, exercise is important. With the MTHFR, those B vitamins are very important. Sometimes choline is really important. So the gene polymorphisms allow us to finesse, angles of attack, so to speak. But what we mustn't think, and I would rather have if I could only have one thing, a homocysteine test, because while having MTHFR test and C67 TTT would probably predict that you're likely to have a raised homocysteine level, why not cut to the functional marker? And in tests, I often like red blood cell tests because the red blood cells live for 3 months. And, something like HbA1c, of course, we'd love to measure insulin resistance, HOMA-IR, and, various other things. But HbA1c is very simple, and it's, 3-month average record, so to speak, of your red blood cells. And the latest tests, because now at the charity, we have this drift test, a home test kit, homocysteine accurately, really accurately, omega-3 index, which is the percentage of EPA and DHA in the red blood cell, HbA1c, vitamin D, and then the last one, which I'm so excited about, is the ratio of glutathione, or GSH, divided by spent or oxidized glutathione, GSSG. So if you think of the glutathione as the water in the fire truck that's putting out all that oxidation in mitochondria, and it turns into steam, and the oxidized glutathione, GSSG, is the steam. So if you've got loads of steam and no water left, you've run out of oxidative capacity. And if you've got loads of glutathione and very little steam, you're in a good place. So
I guess in a sense, that's a real functional, assessment rather than just looking at the one biomarker.
Exactly. So that's what functional measures that, that's nice. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so much rich information here. I think what you've done is painted a picture that there are multiple personalizable interventions that can modify risk and even reverse early disease course at least. And, for people who are listening, like clinicians, I'm wondering if you can give us like a top line summary of key watchouts in their clients, like what are the biomarkers they should be looking for? What are the interventions they should be thinking about? But not just nutrients, also, beyond that into food and diet as well.
Well, just putting aside the exercise, lifestyle, and obvious things like smoking, drinking, etc. I really call them the 4 horsemen of the mental health apocalypse. And the first is brain fats. So I think we've covered omega-3. It's really, really important. And, what I love about measuring the omega-3 index, which has kind of come up to the top as the measure, because there are lots of ways you can measure, but it seems pretty robust. I just did my grandchildren. And I did it, slightly out of the frustration that, we say to our kids, it's really important, to eat fish or, supplement or whatever. And then when they get the blood measure, I go, my child is below the magical 8%, which is optimal. So sometimes blood tests are really, really good, for motivating people. Vitamin D, obviously fantastic. And I think generally we're moving more towards 100 nanomole per L being optimal, but certainly above 75. And I think if you have, a low below 50 level versus a high level, you have 9 times the risk, for dementia. So that's a big factor. We mentioned the homocysteine for the B vitamins. The critical paper, which everyone really should read because it's so beautifully written, 26 pages and a total education, by Professor David Smith. He's A.D. Smith and Helga Refsum, is on homocysteine as a biomarker for 100 diseases. And I think people just don't realize just how deep it goes into gout, osteoporosis, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, heart disease, obviously hypertension. A study by Teng showed that the odds ratio, we get excited when we see an odds ratio of 2, like this doubles the risk. The odds ratio for homocysteine and dementia is 10. But for microvascular disease, cerebrovascular disease, is 17. The odds ratio is 17 times more. It's phenomenal. So that paper, look up biomarkers, homocysteine, A.D. Smith, amazing. Then we haven't really said enough about not just sugar, fructose, glucose, and that whole area, but just last week or 2 weeks ago came out a study from South Korea of 2 million people, or just under 2 million, and it showed that those with metabolic syndrome have I think it was a 24% increased risk of young onset dementia. And by the way, in China, the youngest age of non-genetic Alzheimer's diagnosis is age 19. So we cannot emphasize, however you do it, I say low glycemic load, which factors in both the glycemic index and the quantity of carbs, because if you just eat low GI foods, if you eat a lot of low GI foods, you get high sugar. And, all the keto diets, which is also an extreme version of that, will say have 30 or 50 grams of carbs and no more. But is it 30 or 50 grams of good carbs or bad carbs? Is it carbs full of fiber? What sort of carbs is it? So the glycemic load factors in those two things. You can't cheat on it. If it's high in fiber or high in protein, it will lower the glycemic load. So I love, if I have to pick one measure, it's that. But we're learning a lot about fructose and how the brain can't really use fructose. And a quick sort of hot tip there is that if you are insulin resistant, a lot of people with cognitive decline are, then they can't get the glucose into the neurons, which love either ketones or glucose. So they're basically sugar deprived in their brain, which makes them have brain fog because they can't think and crave sugar. So brain fog and craving sugar usually equals insulin resistance. And it was Professor Stephen Cunnane who really spoke about, he gave a largely C8 carbonate, caprylic acid triglyceride, MCT oil, 2 tablespoons, 30 grams to people, and got a 200. It didn't change the amount of glucose, energy derived from glucose in the brain, but it produced 230% increase in energy derived from ketones on top. And various areas of the brain lit up and their cognitive function improved. So 2 tablespoons of C8 oil is a really quick win to get around insulin resistance, but understand that the brain does not know how to deal with fructose. So it's the high fructose corn syrup and lots of fruit juice rather than fruit. So that's the third horseman of the mental health apocalypse. And the fourth is oxidation antioxidants. HbA1c, and for this one, the glutathione index is, a superb measure. And this is all our, fruit and veg and vitamin C is fantastic. Lately, I've been getting into biquinol. Is a lot more potent than just regular CoQ. And then everyone's gone a bit batshit about NAD, NADPH, and all that sorts of stuff. And there's various patented versions of what ultimately is derived from niacin.
Yeah.
So I'd love to see a proper, comparison of those different metabolites as you move up the pathway, so to speak.
Yeah.
All of them are helping to recycle the glutathione. All of them are helping to recycle ascorbic acid, which has become oxidized hydroascorbate back into active ascorbic acid, which is the extracellular antioxidant that we need the most of, and the intracellular is glutathione in a nutshell. So those are the four, oxidation, glycation, so to speak, methylation, brain fats. If you cover those bases, I don't think anybody could have good scores for those four processes and develop Alzheimer's.
Yeah. I mean, you started this conversation with my burden is, interpreting other people's work and communicating it. And I think it's also your gift. That was a beautiful articulation of a tremendous amount of work over diverse disciplines over long periods of time, and really distilled into something that is immediately practically relevant, and I think should motivate clinicians to really be checking these core, elements and biomarkers, introducing these unpatentable, cheap, accessible, very safe interventions that can modify not only disease risk, but modify disease process as well. Importantly, and you've given several examples of that from the published literature that are really robust and arguably irrefutable. So, I want to round up by asking you one last question, and that's how do listeners find out more about you and the work that you're doing? Is there anything you want to point people to?
Well, yeah, I mean, go to foodforthebrain.org. And right there on the homepage, it says Alzheimer's is preventable. I would say read this book. It's very up to date. It's dense. I didn't write it as a sort of bestseller. I wrote it because of what had to be written. There's 350 references behind it. That will get you very, very rapidly up to speed on this subject. Do the cognitive function test, which is free yourself, which is not a questionnaire, it's an interactive thing, followed by a questionnaire about your diet and lifestyle. And even if you think, I don't need it, do it to help others. Because what I'd like to end really by saying is that the whole point of a randomized control trial, which costs on average $10 million, and by the way, I got information that these latest anti-amyloid trials cost about $200 million each. So by the time you've got a meta-analysis of 10 studies, you're certainly up into the hundreds of millions of dollars. By then, your group of professors are almost certainly on the payroll of this or that or the other. And the idea of all that is then to advise governments to tell us what to do. And we know that even that last phase very rarely works. So here we are in this extraordinary situation. And I'll give the example of driverless cars. Elon Musk, who many people at the moment don't like, failed to make them work. He spent hundreds of millions, got lots of programmers to try to work out all the interactive variables, the confounding factors. It didn't work. And then someone said, you're doing it all wrong. You need big data and AI. And when they got up to 1.3 million people's data, prioritizing five-star Uber drivers, AI worked it out. And now in California, you can get an Uber with no driver and it drives really, really well. So I believe that the days of randomized trial followed by meta-analysis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to drive what we learn are going to come to an end. We hope, and this is why I want you to do the test, and then as a practitioner, you can prescribe it to others, go to organizations and prescribing cognition. It's a really, really good thing to do. We already done 450,000 tests. This year, we hope to test 18 million in China. We've launched in China, Japan, Brazil, Portuguese, America, Canada. We now have the test in German, in Polish. We'd like the money to do Spanish. We're talking to an Arabic edition. And I think it's not impossible for us to be over 2 million people tested within 2 years. Now, that is already 4 times the size of the UK Biobank. It's totally charitable. And then we have all this data on people's cognitive function and all their diet and lifestyle factors. And we just look for the 5-star brainers. Who are the people whose cognitive function stays good? What are they doing? And then our job is to teach others. And people say, well, what about the placebo group? What about the control group? We got all the controls we need. Some people don't stop smoking, don't stop drinking, don't exercise, etc. So I believe the future is going to be big data. And as long as it isn't commercialized, in other words, remains charitable, we have an incredible power. And then everyone's going to come to us to do their research on prevention. And that is the dream. And we call everyone who's done the test a citizen scientist. So we ask you to become one and spread the word. It's all free. And thank you, Ben, and your incredible team at the NMI for spreading the word.
Oh, it's our pleasure. And, thank you so much for the work that you do. It's really hard to understate how important this is. So, thank you on behalf of all of the listeners. And thank you for your time today. It's been really enlightening.
Thanks, Ben. Happy Alzheimer's Prevention Day.